In this video, we're going to go over a couple of examples of using conditionals and loops in C++, and we're going to follow the examples that are given in Strassrup section 2.2.4. I assume that most of you are actually familiar already with the basics of conditionals and loops, so we'll introduce a couple other new things in this video. So let me go over those first. So here is actually our first use of a function besides main. So we have this function called accepts, which takes no parameters and returns a Boolean value. So on the line pointed to by the blue arrow, we are using brace initialization to initialize a char called answer, and we're just using the empty brace initialization here. So that's going to 0 initialize answer. It's just going to give it the value 0. And the value 0, if we look at an ASCII table here, the value 0, the numeric value 0 corresponds to the null character. So it's just the top line there on this table. There's just an ASCII table that I got from Wikipedia. Okay, so the next line waits for the user to type something into standard input cin. The first character typed in becomes the value of the variable answer. So cin is the standard input stream, and here the greater than is called the extraction operator. So it's basically like the opposite of the less than insertion operator that we use with cout. And again, I tell them apart because I think that the insertion operator looks like an open mouth that is saying the string that comes after it. So in the next line, we have our conditional. So we check if the user entered in the character y, and if they did, then we print yay and return true. And we're only going to reach this line of the program if the user did not enter y, and in that case, we're just going to return false. Okay, so now let's add some loops to this example so we can give the user multiple chances to enter a proper value. You know, maybe they make a typo or whatever. So now we give the user a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance. So we have an int variable called tries. We initialize this to be 0. And let me make a little aside point here. So if I didn't put anything inside the brackets here when I initialize tries, it would still be initialized to 0. Because we would still use 0 initialization here to give tries its default value. But I want to communicate here that the value of tries is 0 because it's important for the reader to know what the value of tries is initially so they know how many times the while loop is going to run. On the other hand, the initial value of answer doesn't matter. I just want to initialize it to some value for safety, but we're going to, pretty immediately write over that value with the value entered in by the user. So I want answer to be initialized to something, but that something can be arbitrary. I don't really care what it is. So in the case of answer, I just left the brackets empty. So that communicates that I'm initializing with a value, but that the value is not important. So there's kind of a distinction here between the initialization of answer versus that of tries. Okay, so now moving on to the while loop, we're going to execute that loop as long as tries is at most 4. And inside the loop, we check if we have a else if statement here. So we check if the answer is y. If it is, then we return true. Else we check if the answer is n. If it is, then we return false. Otherwise, then we increment tries and go through the loop again. Finally, at the end of the program, if the user never entered in y or n after 4 tries, then we just return false. So we could also write this program with a for loop instead. The definition of a for loop in C++ has 3 parts. In the first part, we can initialize a variable. So in this case, we again initialize tries to be 0. then we have a semicolon, and next we have the termination condition. So we'll do the loop while tries is at most 4. And again, a semicolon, and then finally the update condition. So here we increment tries by 1. We use the prefix increment operator. And any of these 3 parts can be left empty. So what do you think? Do you prefer the for loop solution or the while loop solution? So here are my thoughts on that question. So in the while loop, we have to define tries before the loop begins. So that means that tries is still in scope. It's still present as a name in our program after the loop finishes. So on this final line of the program where we return false. And there's a difference between the while loop and the for loop, right? Because in the for loop, the scope of tries is just limited to the for loop itself. So as we don't need tries anymore after the program ends, after the loop ends, I would argue that this is a better solution, right? It communicates to the user that this is just a loop variable. We're only using it for the loop and we don't need it anymore afterwards. And in general, it's a good practice to limit the scope of variables to be as small as needed. Okay, so in this case, I would actually argue that the for loop is a better solution.